Hey guys, I'm FDeariso, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, which is Anxiety, Stress, and Mood Relationships. And we're going to focus primarily on anxiety as well as mood state and athletic performance. Some terms to get familiar with before we really dive into this. The first term is affect, and this is the most generic term that we're going to encounter in this chapter, and it describes everything from emotions to feelings and moods. So everything that we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides falls up under this umbrella of affect. An emotion is a situation-specific affective response to the environment. This is your gut reaction, so this is that instantaneous reaction to a stimulus, and it can last for a few seconds to a few minutes or even for a few hours. A mood differs from an emotion in that it can last for weeks or even for months. So it's a little bit more diffuse. And it has more to do with how we feel like we're doing in life than how we react to external stimuli. So this could be how we feel about where we are in relation to our development as an athlete, or how we feel like we're doing in our development as a student. Anxiety is the primary focus of this chapter, and it's believed to have the greatest influence on athletic performance. The text defines anxiety as facing uncertain existential threat. Diving right into anxiety, the first thing that we need to point out is that anxiety is multidimensional. It has both trait and state components. So state anxiety is the immediate emotional state. This is expressed as fear, apprehension, or tension, and we also experience state anxiety as a physiologic reaction. So we see it in a sense of heightened arousal. So you'll see an increased perspiration rate, increased heart rate, or even increased blood pressure. All of those physiologic responses to a stressor. Trait anxiety is a little bit different. This is kind of who your athlete is as a person, and that it's a predisposition to perceive external stimuli as threatening and respond to such stimuli with a heightened state anxiety. So this would be like your senior athlete that's run a time mile before the season to make the team every year, and they've never experienced any failure with it or any difficulty. But even in their senior year, after 3 or 4 years of success, they still get really worked up about this time mile. And that's just who they are. Anxiety is also multidimensional in that it can be expressed mentally and physically. And the way that we experience anxiety mentally is called cognitive anxiety, and it's expressed in things such as fear of failure or negative social evaluation. So an example of cognitive anxiety would be like when a kicker lines up for a game-tying or game-winning field goal, and instead of focusing on kicking the field goal, he's more concerned with what people will say to him at school the next day if he misses. Somatic anxiety is our physical component. And this is how we respond to anxiety physiologically. So this is that increased heart rate, breathing rate, and so on and so forth. The same kicker that was experiencing the cognitive anxiety that I mentioned earlier, he would be showing signs of somatic anxiety by sweating. Because if you've ever seen a kicker sweat when they're not about to kick a big field goal, they're working much harder than any kicker I've ever come across. Now both state and trait anxiety are believed to have cognitive and somatic pieces. In sports psychology, this idea is called multidimensional anxiety theory. Short video to kind of give you an idea of all of these terms that we've discussed as they relate to anxiety. So what's important here is to remember that stress is a process and not an outcome. Stress begins with a stimulus and ends in the response. However, in between there's cognition, which is how an athlete processes the stimulus to produce the response. So what's important to point out is that if we can change the way that an athlete perceives the stimulus, we can change the way he thinks about it, and we can result in less stress and less anxiety to it. The stimulus is almost always a competitive environment, and in and of itself, it is not stressful. But the athlete's interpretation of the stimulus is what determines whether or not they experience anxiety or stress. So in order to determine whether or not something is stressful, the athlete will have to go through an appraisal process. The first part is called the primary appraisal, in which the athlete decides if he or she cares about whether they succeed or fail, so if they have a personal stake in the outcome or not. If the athlete does not feel that the outcome is important to him or her, then the secondary appraisal doesn't matter nearly as much. However, if the athlete feels that this outcome is really important to them, then the secondary appraisal becomes really important. In the secondary appraisal, the athlete will gauge his or her ability to deal with the situation or to cope with the demands that they're about to have to face. So a simple example would be an athlete who thinks, it's important and I know I can do it. This would be like you're a senior athlete on the basketball team walking up to the free throw line to hit that game-tying free throw to send it into overtime. He knows that he has the physical tools to do it, and he knows it's important, but because of his confidence in his ability, he creates a low-stress situation, so he has no stress response, and it creates a sense of balance. However, if it's a freshman walking up to that line, he's going to be thinking, I know this free throw is really important, but I don't think I have the ability to do it. And this creates a high-stress situation, so a high-stress response, and it creates a state of imbalance. Now, obviously, if that freshman walks up to the line and he says, this free throw doesn't really matter, I'm just a freshman, he's not going to do much thinking about whether or not his abilities are good enough, and so he's never really going to enter a high-stress situation. Two other kinds of stress that we can talk about, the first of which is organizational stress. And this is a stress created by the competitive sport environment, not just one specific situation or event. Now, there are four primary sources that can combine or act independently to put anxiety on an athlete and create organizational stress. The first source is environmental issues. So this could be anything ranging from how loud the crowd is at the venue that day to what the hotel beds were like and whether or not that athlete got enough sleep, if it's hotter than they're used to, if it's colder than they're used to. All of the things that kind of create that game day atmosphere and that environment in which they're about to compete. The next source of organizational stress is personal issues. Personal issues can be any array of things. This can be a person's predisposition to injury, whether they're thinking about the chances of them getting hurt in this game. It can be whether or not they had an argument with their boyfriend or girlfriend before they left home, if they feel like they got enough to eat at the team dinner. Any number of things can be a personal issue. Leadership issues really kind of relate more to a coaching staff, and I think that you could even attribute leadership issues to your communication with a team captain. So it could be something like whether or not they feel like they're getting positive or negative reinforcement, whether or not they feel like the coaching staff is going to support them no matter what. Team issues, this is kind of what the locker room's like. Is your team supporting you? Is it a healthy team atmosphere? Are y'all communicating effectively? So like I said, any of these four sources can come together to create organizational stress, or they can act independently to give additional stressors to an athlete. Another type of anxiety that a lot of athletes face is competitive state anxiety, and this is also called pre-competitive state anxiety. Pre-competitive state anxiety is generated by antecedents, or factors that are present before an event takes place that create this sense of anxiety or heightened response. There are 5 commonly identified factors. These factors are a fear of failure, a fear of negative social evaluation, a fear of physical harm, social ambiguity, and disruption of routine. The first factor, fear of failure, is pretty self-explanatory. This is an athlete's fear that he is not going to be able to perform the task that he's being requested to complete. A fear of negative social evaluation, this is our kicker that's really nervous about how he's going to be perceived at school the next day if he misses the field goal. A fear of physical harm. This is relating back to an athlete's concern about their chances of being injured. So like Cam Newton in the Super Bowl when he chose not to dive on the fumble, that would be a fear of physical harm. Situation ambiguity, I had a little bit of trouble understanding initially, but now I understand it to be like if a quarterback broke the huddle and he went to scan the defense and all of a sudden they're in a formation that he never saw on film and has never seen before. The situation is ambiguous, and he's just going to have to go with his best guess on the upcoming play. The final antecedent that we commonly see in competitive state anxiety is disruption of routine. This can occur at any point leading up to competition. So if you were late to pregame warm-ups and you didn't have time to tie your shoes just right, or maybe you had to rush through a portion of the warm-up routine, even to right before a play, if a shortstop typically grabs a handful of dirt and wipes his hand off to get a little extra grip on the ball before every pitch, if he's too caught up in the signs and he doesn't have an opportunity to do that, now he's got a little bit of anxiety because he wasn't able to complete his ritual or his routine. By analyzing an athlete's ability to cope with these antecedents, and as well as monitoring how these antecedents manifest themselves in an athlete, we as sports psychologists are going to be able to identify any sort of potential imbalance or stressful situation that we're going to see, as well as gauge the athlete's ability to cope. This is a short video about how Michael Jordan got ready before games, sort of how he prepared his psyche to deal with the demands that were about to be placed upon him. Pre-competition cognitive and somatic anxiety. This is really important to note. As we talked about earlier, cognitive and somatic anxiety express themselves mentally and physically, and they always manifest themselves differently and at different time periods before and during an event. So somatic anxiety is usually low until 24 hours up to game time, and it gets really, really ramped up as the event looms closer and closer. However, once the event begins, the athlete will experience a rapid relief of somatic anxiety. They're going to get back in their routine, they're going to be competing in the event, and then it becomes all about the cognitive anxiety. Cognitive anxiety starts high and stays relatively high for the days leading up to the event. So all week during practice on that Monday, if it's a high school football player, they're thinking about the game, and it just continues to stay at that level up until kickoff. Once the ball is kicked off, though, anxiety is going to spike and flatline according to how the athlete is performing throughout the event. So our cognitive anxiety is almost in direct correlation with whether or not we feel that we're going to be successful or fail in the athletic event. The more that we feel like we're going to succeed, the lower cognitive anxiety is going to be. The less likely we feel we are to succeed, the higher our cognitive anxiety is going to be. Mood state and athletic performance. Going back to some of our definitions, a mood state, this differs from an emotion in that it is more general, and it's permanent or semi-permanent, so it can last for weeks or even months. It's more stable and long-lasting, but it isn't set in stone. The way that we measure mood states is by using our most commonly utilized inventory called the Profile of Mood States, commonly abbreviated POMS or POMS. And it measures 6 mood states: tension, depression, anger, vigor, fatigue, and confusion. The states of tension, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion are all negative. The only positive mood state is labeled as vigor. The POMS scores in athletes. Research supports that elite athletes have a mood profile higher in vigor and lower in negative moods than a normal sample. And it also supports that elite athletes have a healthier mood profile overall than less successful athletes. So what this means is that we're going to see athletes score lower in those 5 negative mood states, and they're going to score higher in vigor than less successful athletes. So if we compare Michael Jordan to, say, Dwight Howard, Michael Jordan would be lower up until he hit vigor, and then he would be much higher than Dwight Howard. Elite athletes typically have a mood profile that resembles an iceberg, so you have low scores on your negative traits with a spike in the middle for high vigor scores compared to normative values. And this is typically called an iceberg profile. This is what an iceberg profile looks like. So you see tension, depression, and anger are typically listed as the first 3 mood states analyzed. And then you see the spike for vigor, followed by the fall for fatigue and confusion. And you kind of see where the mean score runs across the middle there. Our elite athletes are always going to be below those mean scores, except for when it comes to vigor, where they're going to be above those mean scores. Pre-competitive mood as a performance indicator. It's important to note that this is strictly theoretical, but we do have a conceptual model. So we haven't been able to test and retest for validity and reliability, but we do have a pretty good idea of what we think happens. Lane and Terry proposed that depression is a moderator of all the other moods in athletic performance. So depression is going to immediately impact whether or not somebody is successful athletically, as well as kind of give us a good indicator for what the other 5 moods are going to look like. High depression typically leads to higher scores in anger, tension, confusion, and fatigue, while negatively impacting vigor, according to Lane and Terry. Now, the absence of depression doesn't necessarily mean that you are instantly a more successful athlete or you're going to perform better. Vigor will always have a facilitative effect on performance, meaning that it's always going to increase your performance, while fatigue and confusion will decrease performance. The interesting thing is that anger and tension have a curvilinear relationship to performance. So anger and tension are actually a good thing up until a certain point. But once you hit that certain point, you're going to see that anger and tension are actually going to prevent the athlete from performing at their top level. Fatigue and confusion are universal hindrances. They're always going to hinder an athlete and keep them from reaching their peak potential in a competition, regardless of whether or not depression is present.